Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 3 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills, and I help you on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by Jack and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. And today's topic is the question, are 2-mana draw 2s good in Commander? So this is an interesting concept. I think a lot of people have a strong opinion one way or the other. One of the reasons why I chose this topic, though, is because of a Reddit post that says, is Winged Words incredibly underrated? And so it's a great Reddit post. I will definitely put the link to it in the description down below. But they're talking about how they play this card called Winged Words. And in EDH Rec, they see that it's only played in 1% of the blue decks. And so even in a commander with flying, they made a mention here that it's not even in the top 4. It's not in the top 10 for more than 4 of the most popular commanders with flying that have blue. So what does Winged Words say? It's a 3-mana spell, costs 2 generic and a blue. It's a sorcery, says you draw 2 cards, but it costs 1 less if you control a creature with flying. So if you've got a commander with flying, this is a 2-mana, draw 2. And they made an allusion here. Some of the individuals that are responding say, "Oh, this is like Night's Whisper, which is in black. Another sorcery costs 1 generic and 1 black. You draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. And I think Sign in Blood is the same thing, except it costs black, and then it's target player, so you could target an opponent if you wanted to. So what about all these spells, right? You've got cards that are really, really well known. They draw 2 cards. And sometimes they don't even draw 2 cards, like Expressive Iteration kind of draws 2 cards as well, and it's a 2-mana spell. Costs a red and a blue. It's, I believe, a sorcery. And then you look at the top 3 cards of your library. One of them you'll put into, I want to say, you'll put at the bottom of your library. One you'll put into your hand, and then one you'll put into exile, and you can cast it that turn. So kind of like a draw 2 for 2 mana. What do I think about all those things? I think this is not going to be the right answer for everybody, but I can talk about what the right answer is for me. So I mentioned this in a previous episode already, but I think Commander is one of the most beautiful formats because you don't have to solve it the same way as somebody else. Whereas in Standard, there is a deck that's, in some cases, the best deck to play. In other cases, there's a wide variety of decks that you can choose from. But let's say your play style is not really good for any of those decks, then you won't be able to solve the format. You won't be able to find something that you're going to be really good with. So let's say we're in a Standard where everybody's playing control. Even the aggro decks are doing control stuff, which I don't even know if that's possible. But if you're not a control player, you're going to have a hard time in a metagame like that. Commander is nice because whatever you want to do, there is a way to do it and win and be successful with it. The reason why is because you're playing multiplayer, and if you're playing something very, very strong, that's a great way to lose because then people will know that it's something strong and they'll try to take you out first. You'll have 3 opponents instead of sometimes 1 or 2. And so those opponents that we think of as opponents, they're not always against you. They're not always going to be your enemies. Sometimes they'll be your friends, and that's just how Commander works. So whatever you want to do to solve the format, you can solve it in your way. There's not a wrong way to solve it. There are some things that you can do that aren't going to ever be good, right? You can play a deck that can't win at all. But if you're trying to win in a certain way, unless it's going to be too strong, it's not going to be bad. So that's where it comes back to this idea of the draw 2 for 2-mana spells. Personally, I don't like them a whole lot, and I find that when I do play them, I tend to have less success. My decks tend to not do as well if I play those over something else. So what are some of the other things that I would be playing in their place? I think if you've got the card draw that you need in a deck, these are going to be kind of superfluous. Whereas if you are not playing enough card draw, then I would probably just play the best card draw and not really resort to these. I feel like these are kind of subpar. Now, why do I say that? To understand my perspective here, I think it's great to think about it from other perspectives. I mentioned also my ramp. I try to look for ramp that is producing 2 or more mana, because if it's producing only 1 mana, it doesn't really jive with what I'm trying to do, how I'm trying to win. And I guess one way to describe that is it's just too small of an effect. That effect is too small for me to use up a card slot for it. So it's not a big enough effect for me to donate a whole slot to that particular effect. That's the way I look at these. I look at them as being card draw, but it's not as good as the other options, so I don't want to use up a card slot on something that's going to just draw me 2 cards for only 2 mana. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about another kind of an analog, something that we can use as an analogy to figure out this idea. Let's say I'm playing a token deck, right? I might play something like Avenger of Zendikar. It's a 7 mana creature. If I remember correctly, it costs 5 generic and 2 green. I don't remember the stats, but I know it has 2 really important abilities. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 plant for each land you control. So if you have 5 lands, you're going to create 5 tokens, right? 5 0/1 green plant tokens. Then it has another ability: whenever a land enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. And it itself is not a plant. I believe it's an elemental, if I'm remembering correctly. And so the idea is you can play this down, get a bunch of tokens, and then you can also buff up those tokens with lands that are entering the battlefield under your control. So let's say I'm playing a token deck. Would I use up a card slot to Avenger of Zendikar if I'm playing green? Honestly, probably, right? Because I think if I'm playing green, it's likely that at least some of my ramp is going to be in the form of land searching. And so I'm probably going to have a good number of lands at some point. And if I'm playing out a 7-drop creature, I probably do have 7 lands, and maybe even more. So I get this card down. I get, let's say, 7 tokens if I have 7 lands. So I've got 8 bodies thanks to 1 card. And yeah, 7 of those cards are 0/1s. But if I'm playing a token deck, I'm not really worried about how big the tokens are usually. Most of the time, I just want to have those bodies because I'm going to buff all the tokens up anyways later on, whether it's something like a Craterhoof or an Overrun or some type of effect like that. Overrun here is a 5 mana sorcery that says each creature you control gets +3/+3 in trample. So even if we didn't put any counters on those plants with Avenger of Zendikar's ability, the landfall ability, those are still going to be 3/4 tramples, and those are some pretty good creatures to attack with. So it can kind of end the game pretty easily, and sometimes out of nowhere. So if I'm looking for a card like that, would I play something like Krenko's Command? Krenko's Command is a 2 mana sorcery that says create 2 1/1 goblin creature tokens. I think they're red. I don't know if that matters, but you get some red tokens. So the question that you could ask is, hey, is it worth playing a Krenko's Command? So let's take a look at some of the comparisons. Krenko's Command is a lot cheaper, right? You're using up 2 mana to get 2 creatures. With the Avenger of Zendikar, you're using up 7 mana. It's going to be way harder to find a time to play a 7 mana spell compared to a 2 mana one, right? Well, you're forgetting one additional thing, and some people might say that I'm making a straw man argument, but I am kind of arguing with somebody who doesn't exist just to put bring my point across. You're not just paying the mana. You're also paying up a card from your hand. So if you look up 2 mana +1 card is not as good of a ratio, in my mind at least, of resources to what I'm getting out of those resources as Avenger of Zendikar. Yes, I'm paying more mana, but I'm not using up more cards, right? So I'm not using up what would be like 3 times as many cards from my hand in order to get the same ratio of tokens to cards. So I'm using up 1 card in both cases, but in one situation I'm getting a significantly larger number of tokens. And that's where I think this card draw comes into play, especially when we're looking up what we're actually using in terms of our resources. So when we're doing card draw, we want to try to use up few cards from our hand. And why is that? Well, because we're trying to draw cards. Obviously, if we're trying to draw cards, having the number of cards in our hand stay high is very important. If I'm playing a bunch of cantrips, I might be drawing 7 cards in a turn, but each one of those cantrips is also using a card from my hand. And so I might just stay the same, right? So a cantrip is any card that costs 1 mana. Sometimes it's an instant. Most of the time it's instant. Sometimes it's a sorcery. It's a 1 mana spell. You play it. It lets you draw a card. Sometimes it has another effect that may or may not be helpful, but the idea behind it is 1 mana, draw a card. So even if I'm casting 7 of those in a turn, I'm not actually drawing any cards because I keep using cards up from my hand. That's where I feel like these draw 2s kind of fail for me. You're not drawing 2 cards off of them. You're using up 1 card and then drawing 2. So in a way, you're really just drawing 1 card per card that you cast. So would I rather spend 2 mana and go up 1 card in hand, or would I rather spend 4 mana and go up 2 cards in hand with something like a Harmonize? Harmonize is a 4 mana sorcery, costs 2 generic and 2 green, and it just says draw 3 cards. So I would much rather play a card like that than a card like Winged Words, even though that one can cost just 2 and it can get me 2 cards. I'd rather spend 4 mana, twice as much, and get twice as much advantage. Why is that? Well, why would I be okay spending way more mana for a spell that does something in Commander? Why wouldn't I just want to have a low CMC? Isn't it good to have a low CMC? Like having a low average mana value to your deck, doesn't that make your deck stronger? Well, some people will say yes. I'm of the opinion that I don't think so. I think having a low mana value is great in some situations, but not necessarily all situations. I think there are certainly times where your deck might be floundering and not doing anything of significant importance and finding itself constantly losing the game because it doesn't have enough cards in there that are going to affect the game to a large degree. Or you might find yourself not having enough cards in hand to do a whole lot during each turn. And so you're finding, hey, I'm passing the turn with 5 mana up, not ready to do anything. And now it's the next turn it's 6 mana, and the turn after that it's 3 mana, and the turn after that it's 4 mana, right? And so you're constantly losing out on mana because you don't have enough cards to cast a bunch of things in the same turn. Using those draw 2 cards, I think, is part of the problem. Now, does that mean that I can't build a solid deck with these in there? Oh, of course I could, right? I could be playing 9 card draw effects and then having a bunch of these on top of that card draw. And so if I didn't have a problem with card draw before, I'm not going to have a problem with card draw now. So yes, you could definitely build a deck where you have all those cards in it, but you've got to take something out to put them in. So what am I taking out? Am I taking out board wipes? In that case, then I might not have enough board wipes for the game. Am I taking out spot removal? Somebody might be able to combo off, and I might die that way instead of to a big board of creatures like a board wipe would be helping me with. Am I not playing enough ramp? And then I find myself with a full hand, but not enough mana to cast stuff. Right? There's all these things that might be happening, and I might be finding myself not really able to do what I want to do. And I think kind of the hardest part is sometimes players take out lands, or sometimes players take out win conditions. Some of those are the most common things that people take out to put stuff in. And so it's probably a good idea to really think about the card draw that you want to play and think about it in terms of how you typically play your decks. Are you trying to draw cards when you find, oh my gosh, I'm down to 3 cards in hand, I'm down to 2 cards in hand, I got to do something so that I can get back and have enough cards to play multiple cards per turn? If that's what you're finding yourself, if you're finding yourself in a situation like that, I would definitely stick to either the cards that are going to net you 2 or more cards per spell that you cast, or instead I would look for things that are repeatable. And part of the reason why I'm suggesting that is because of the nature of Commander. Typically, non-CEDH Commander games go until about turn 12, and it's a little bit of variation from playgroup to playgroup. Some playgroups have a lot of answers, and so it typically goes to turn 14 or 16 as people are really good at stopping each other. Other playgroups don't have a whole lot of board wipes, and so theirs might be going only to turn 8, right, or turn 9. But regardless of what type of playgroup you're in, turn 8 I think is probably the fastest you can expect it, and then it can go up, way higher than that. And then CEDH is an entirely different format in my opinion, so we're not even going to jump into that. Especially that I don't really know much about CEDH enough to be having a podcast on it, so that's kind of obvious at this point. But when it comes to this card draw, the one that I like most myself is the repeatable card draw. Card draw permanents that come down, they stay on the battlefield until somebody gets rid of them, but they stay on the battlefield and they constantly keep getting you cards after cards after cards. A great example of this is Rhystic Study, although depending on who you ask, they might say, well, Rhystic Study is more of a tax piece, as you're taxing your opponents. And so they're not often going to be letting you draw cards, so it's not really a card draw option. And to that's fair. That's a fair point. So maybe a better example would be something like Phyrexian Arena. Rhystic Study, by the way, is a 3 mana enchantment, costs 2 generic and a blue. And then it says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you draw a card unless they pay 1 mana. So they get a pick. Do they want to have all their spells cost 1 more to play? Or would they rather you draw cards, when they're not paying that 1 mana? So some people say that's card draw, some people don't. I think it is because it happens often enough where people do allow you to draw a card or 2 per round of the table, and that's pretty good. Phyrexian Arena, 3 mana enchantment as well. This one costs 1 generic and 2 black, and then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and draw a card. So every turn, instead of just drawing the 1 card for your draw step, you'll also be drawing another card during your upkeep. Yes, you'll lose 1 life, but 1 life in the grand scheme of things is not really that big of a deal. So Phyrexian Arena is one of those cards where you're drawing 2 cards per turn. So if you're trying to play 2 spells per turn as well, then you're staying at net 0, right? Play a land, cast a spell. Play a land, cast a spell. Now I don't have any more land drops. Cast a spell, cast a spell. Cast a spell, cast. And so you're doing that each turn, casting 2 spells or playing a land and casting 1 spell. And that will allow you to be okay. You're not going to run out of cards in your hand if that's the game plan that you're going for. And on top of that, you'll be doing a lot more stuff during your turn if you're also ramping, so where you're using your card draw and your ramp to play more spells per turn than you would be able to otherwise, because of the limitation on 1 land drop and the limitation of you're only drawing 1 additional card per turn naturally. So with all that said, what are my recommendations? How do I play and why do I think it's good? I personally like to use most of my decks. I like to use repeatable card draw. If you're in blue, that's stuff like Rhystic Study. Mystic Remora is another good option. I also like Psychic Possession. That's a card I like. Some people don't like it, but I like that card. If I'm in green, I definitely love Compost. That's one of my favorite cards in green of all time. I like Compost a lot. If I'm in red, I might be looking at something like Outpost Siege or Vance's Blasting Cannons, or that new one, Visions of Phyrexia. I like that one a lot too. If I'm in black, I already mentioned Phyrexian Arena. Sometimes I also play Underworld Connections. And so there's a lot of cards that I like. What did I miss here? White. Yeah, White has a couple of good ones too, especially recently. Esper Sentinel is a great example. I also am liking... what is that white card with the raccoons on the art? It was from New Capenna. It was Smuggler's Share. I think that's the name of the card, Smuggler's Share. Some people are not liking it. I haven't really had enough experience with it to know if I like it or not. But that's one of the white card draw options that I'm liking at the moment, at least. So yeah, there's plenty of options. If you're playing any deck, I kind of like Mind's Eye. I keep going back to it as a backup. It's not my favorite, and I don't really use it if I have better options, and most of the time I do. But every now and then I'll find myself in a situation where it's like, I'm not really having any other options. Let's just toss a Mind's Eye in there. So that's the type of card draw that I like. If I can draw multiple cards per turn, thanks to a 1 card that I'm playing on the battlefield, typically you'll find that players don't use up their removal on that, because if you use up your removal on somebody's card draw, then you don't have that removal to stop somebody from comboing off. And it is so much easier to combo off in Commander than it is to win with, an aggro-y, combat-y kind of deck, or to try to control 3 players and control them out. So, aggro and control aren't as easy as combo. So you got to be ready for the combo, and I think the best way to be ready for combo is with spot removal. So typically you're not going to find people using their spot removal on your card draw or on your ramp unless it's really, really good. Something like Necropotence, right? That would be an example of someone saying, hey, we got to take out this card draw right now. It might even be too late, but we still got to try, and so that's something that I think is important to think about. So kind of wrapping things up here, what are my thoughts on the draw 2 options? Like I said, I'm not a big fan of them, but maybe you are. And that's okay. If you are, that's totally fine. You might find that they're super effective for you. I know Dana Roach from the EDH Rec podcast, I know he's a huge fan of those cards. He posted something on Twitter the other day that was probably well, I'm not going to say anything. But I know he really likes those cards. And that's fine. That's the way he enjoys to play. That's fine. I don't think it meshes really well with my approach to Commander. One thing I will say, though, is I do have 2 decks where I'm not playing a whole lot of that repeatable card draw. So I have a white-blue control deck where instead I'm relying more on instants. I'm looking for those instants that are drawing 4, 5, 6, 7 cards per card. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not even going to a whole lot of the draw 3, although there are some in there. And so that's part of how I do it. I try to go for those things that are going to let me draw a lot of cards. Why? Well, because if you're playing control, you're typically playing a whole lot of flash stuff. The things that you're playing on your turn are not going to be very expensive in mana value, and you're going to kind of try to hold up your mana most of the time to play a bunch of instants. And so drawing cards when you have low cards in hand, it's not easy to use up 3 or 4 or 5 mana to get a card draw option on the board. It's much easier instead to just wait until everybody's tapped out, and then, it's right before your turn, you tap 6 mana, play something that lets you draw 4 cards, and bam, you're back up to 7, And so that's what I do there. I've got another deck as well that's also kind of a Spellslinger-ish kind of deck. That white-blue control deck, before I move on, that is helmed by Midome the Ageless. It's a 6-mana Azorius commander. Costs 4 generic, a white and a blue. It's a 4/4 flying Sphinx that says when it deals combat damage to a player, you take an extra turn, and it also says it can't attack during extra turns. So that's my commander that I have for my control deck. Then I also have another deck. It's a Grixis deck that has kind of a small sub-theme of Spellslingers, although it's more of a creature-based deck. And the way it works is the commander is Cormella Glamour Thief. And so she's got a couple of abilities. She's a 4-mana, I want to say 2/4. I might be remembering the stats wrong here. But she costs 1 generic, 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red. She has haste, and you can pay 1 mana, or 1 generic mana, tap her, and she'll add 3 mana to your mana pool. It's 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red. But you can only use that mana to cast a sorcery spell or an instant spell. And then when she dies, you return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. So I use that deck with a lot of self-mill to be able to get Rise of the Dark Realms and a bunch of creatures into the graveyard. Then when Cormella dies, then I get the Rise of the Dark Realms to the hand. I can play it and get all those creatures onto the battlefield. And a lot of them have ETBs where, kind of like Purphoros or Impact Tremors. They're just all entering and immediately killing all my opponents when I cast the Rise of the Dark Realms. And in that deck, yeah, I could use regular card draw, but if I'm using sorcery or instant versions, usually it's actually more sorceries than anything, then 1, I can get it back with Cormella if I need to. So when I'm in a pinch, I have recursion from the command zone to get my card draw out of the graveyard. And on top of that, I can also tap her for mana. So instead of, using up, let's say something like 4 mana on the blue version of Harmonize, which I'm blanking on right now in my head. But if the blue version of it, which is a 4 mana draw 3, instead of thinking about it as 4 mana, I can tap a blue or I can tap an island for blue, and I tap something else and then tap Cormella, and bam, I've got the 4 mana that I need. So instead of paying 4 mana, in essence, I'm paying 2 mana for that. So that's one of the reasons why I use those types of effects in those decks. So yes, most of the time I'm using the recurring or repeatable card draw to get card draw throughout the entire game. And then in some decks, it's going to be the right answer to go for instants or sorceries instead, the burst card draw. But even in those situations, I'm still not a huge fan of the 2 mana draw 2s. Again, they're too small for my taste. And my approach in Commander is typically going to be relying a lot more on things that are better for the card slot. So I'm not using up 1 card slot to do just something small that's not really going to be a big deal. So with wrapping things up here, just wanted to say that's just my opinion. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with me? Or are you feeling like I'm totally missing something obvious? I'd love to hear your thoughts in a comment, either at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg, that's where you can find this podcast, or twitter.com/magical__hacker. You can definitely tweet at me anytime you'd like. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. Thank you again to Jack. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.